Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our regular Thursday lecture. My name is Victoria. I'm the Outreach Coordinator for Education USA here in Ukraine. And today we've prepared a very special lecture for you. We're going to talk about dreams coming true for our Ukrainian students and take an inside look into the life of a Ukrainian student at an American university. So don't miss your chance to find the answers to all your burning questions about the application process, essay writing, seeking funding, of course, and most importantly, what it's really like to study at an American university. Here, joining us today are two wonderful guests, Kirill Koroля, a Ukrainian student who's currently studying at Stanford Law School, and Tetyaну Anдріюk, who is enrolled in a graduate program at the University of Washington. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. And for anyone tuning in from their homes, please do not hesitate to put in a question in the bar down below. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions. And let's get started. So, Kirill, would you like to say a few words about yourself and your journey to studying in the US?
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Kirill. I'm a law student at the Stanford Law School. And my path to the US University was rather unconventional. It took me quite a long time to get here and a couple of tries. So I hope it's not going to be your case, but I've prepared a little presentation to provide you with some useful tips and tricks, and also something that you might use in your path that I think is going to be helpful.
Kirill, thank you so much. And Tetiana, thank you once again for joining us today. It's wonderful to have you here. Would you mind saying a few words about yourself and your journey to studying in the US?
Hi, sure. So my name is Tetяни Андріюк. I'm a Japanese linguistics student at the University of Washington. So my admissions process here was quite long as well. So I started my preparation 2 years ago, but so yes, now I'm here, and that is what I'm going to share with you today about.
Thank you so much. Seeing as we don't have any questions as of yet, Kirill, would you mind elaborating a bit on your experience and telling us a bit more about your journey to US study and your experiences so far?
Absolutely. I titled my presentation "Success Story," but it was kind of a success story, quote unquote. I'm gonna talk about my experience with the admissions process, probably go into details about standardized tests, how I took my test, how I wrote my personal statement, how I researched financial aid, and if you have any questions, feel free to send them in the chat box. I'm also going to tell some things that worked for me and might work for you, and I'm going to explain in a little bit why that is the case. Mainly, because the admissions process to a law school in the US is a little bit different from other programs. So yeah, as I said, my experiences were quite unusual, and the reason for that is that I basically tried to apply for U.S. university 3 times, and that was within a very long period of time. So the application process, I just wanted to say that it's challenging, as everyone says, and you definitely need to start preparing in advance. But it's not that hard. And by saying it's not that hard, I mean it's nothing compared to what you're gonna do here when you actually begin your studies. let me talk about my background a bit, because I think it's relevant to how I actually got in. So I lived in the U.S. Some time ago. I spent a year um, at the exchange program um, called the Future Leaders Exchange Program back in high school. I lived in Washington, D.C., and during my studies there, I took a class. It was called Street Law. It was related to um, studying provisions of the U.S. Constitution, and the course ended with kind of a moot court, like a mm, presentation that simulated a court hearing, and that was in front of a real judge. And we had to prepare. We had all of the materials that were not real. It was a fictional story, a fictional case, but we had to do this, and then we competed with other schools in the district. And I found it really interesting, and I thought that this is something that I might want to do. Unfortunately, in the U.S., there are no law programs for undergraduate students. Law school is a professional school, the same as the medical school or business school, which means that you need to study somewhere else, and apply for a professional program after you've completed your undergrad. And you could study anywhere. Like you could become a designer, an engineer, or you could study political sciences or international relations, um, and then go to a law school. But that's the American approach. So I applied for an undergrad program in Ukraine, and I was planning to apply for a US school right after. I took a standardized test, prepared my application. I applied, and I didn't get in. And then, I had to make some choice about where I want to study next. And I found this great university in Ukraine called UKU in Lviv. They had a wonderful program about human rights. So I studied there. I've done my master's, and then I thought that this is something that I should do again. I should apply for a program again in the U.S. And I didn't get in again. And then finally, after I actually worked for a number of years in Ukraine, I applied. Just that was my final attempt. I didn't think that I would get in, but I got in for some reason. I think the reason why it's relevant is if you're applying for a master's program, it usually makes sense to have some prior experience between, or at least some kind of experience either during your undergrad or after your undergrad. At least this is what I observe here. A lot of students had some kind of a gap year, or they've done something else. They either volunteered, they've done some additional extracurriculars at the university, and we definitely have students who went straight from undergrad to a law school. Here they are called kindergarten through JD, because JD is the name of the degree, and basically means that the person studied all the way from kindergarten to a JD program without gaps. But here there are not a lot of them. It's usually someone who either had some prior experience, work experience, or something that they've done during their undergrad, maybe participated in some kind of a organization. There are a bunch of them, and I just want to stress that I think right now there's a lot you can do in Ukraine or outside Ukraine that's related to Ukraine, that's related to volunteering, community service, helping Ukraine wins the war, that's probably gonna benefit you in the long run if you decide to apply. As to the application process, I was on my own, and the reason for that is there are not a lot of people that decide to study law in Ukraine and then continue their studies in the US. And I think the reason is twofold. One, the system of laws is different in the US. And just not to be a nerd about it, Ukraine has basically laws that are written in the book that you refer to. And the US has what's it called, the precedent system or case law system or common law system, which basically means that they rely on what judges said before, and they think that this is a law. So, and just because of that, I don't think a lot of people decide to change their career because of that, because it also requires a lot of retraining. That's one thing. Another thing is it's very difficult to find funding very difficult to find funding for a law school, and I'll talk about it in a minute. So as I said, I think it's a rather unconventional experience that I had, but I figured out some tips, like general tips that might be useful for your experience, and put them in the presentation here. So as to researching schools and programs, my approach was Googling. There's a wonderful website called US News Rankings. It's a website that provides information about ranking of US schools in different different degrees, different programs. You can basically go there, type in what you want to study, and it's going to show you the ranking. That they have some kind of methodology, but they come up with this sophisticated system where they basically place all the universities in the US into some kind of ranking, and you can see which schools are the best, which schools are like the medium level schools. And it was really helpful. First of all, because this way you could see the general picture of how you're where you can study what you want to study. Another thing is that it also allows you to come up with this 3-3-3 approach when you actually figure out where you want to apply. I've heard about this approach from a number of people before I applied, and I think Education USA counselors also recommend this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it basically means that if you want to apply to schools, you should choose an equal number of schools from the top ranking, schools that are hard to get in, schools that you have like 50-50 chances, and then schools that that you're probably gonna get in if you apply. You can probably check your programs section on this US News Rankings website. But because for law school, for example, they had standardized tests scores for each school, like the median scores, and then the highest, the lowest score too. That allowed me to see like what my chances are in applying to each of these schools, and it helped me to come up with a final list of programs and a final list of universities where I would apply. I've put it here in the presentation, standardized tests are not an obstacle. And by this, I mean, like practically how it was for me. I researched universities. I found universities that are very hard to get in. And I saw that, they require, they don't require, because they always say that there is a holistic process of evaluating your application, which means that they take everything that you've applied with, like your personal statement, your grades, your extracurriculars, your resume, letters of recommendation if they require them, and they make a holistic decision. But still, for some programs, at least for law programs, they also have kind of like the recommended score, or the score that they accepted people with this score throughout the years, and this is basically some threshold that they use unless you have some exceptional activities in your resume. It's very unlikely that they will pick you. So by saying standardized tests are not an obstacle, basically mean that if you apply with a score that's lower, it doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get in. It usually means that there's a lower chance of you getting in. But if you have something great on the resume, and we'll probably talk about this a bit, it's this is something that's not gonna preclude you from getting in. So don't worry about this too much. That doesn't mean that you don't have to prepare for standardized tests. In terms of financial aid considerations and application fees, I would say that they probably are an obstacle for a number of students. Speaking of application fees, this is an unexpected part of applying for schools, at least for law schools. Application fees are huge, especially if you convert them from, they're in US dollars, and for each application you would have to pay this fee. If you want to apply to 10 universities, for example, which is not a lot, that would usually mean that you would have to pay, it depends on the program. I've heard that MBA students pay around $200 per application. I don't know if it's true. I'm for other programs it's definitely less than that, but you should definitely keep that in mind. One great thing about application fees is that a lot of them can be waived for students that can prove that their income is low, which is given US requirements, and US average income is probably going to apply to 99% of people currently living in Ukraine. This is something that you should do your research on. Basically, go to a university website and check this out. If they have this opportunity, you should take it. And it usually involves emailing the admissions office saying that, here's my proof of income, or here are my assets, or here's the information that I want to self-report about my income, which usually involves like providing a standardized form that they have on their website, basically filled in. It usually allows you to waive most of your fees. For me, I waived the larger portion of the fees. There was still like a small bit that I had to pay, which was kind of like a service fee, but that was really helpful. And then financial aid considerations. Programs in the US are really expensive. They're extremely expensive, and this is something that you should consider way in advance. I'm going to tell you about my experience with this, but this is something that you have to consider, because if you see that there's no way you can apply for financial aid, or there's no way you can get the money through a grant or a scholarship, then you're basically stuck. And I think this is a much, much bigger problem than, performing poorly on a standardized test. Speaking of application process, it can be standardized, which means that you apply to a bunch of schools through one provider, which means that you don't have to worry about, or don't worry too much about requirements of different universities. For law schools, there's like the single provider called the LSAC, Law School Admissions Council, that processes all the applications, which means that, for example, if you take a standardized test, they also administer it, and they're going to report your scores to all universities that you've applied to. If you submit your resume once, you don't have to submit it to each school separately. If they ask you to submit your transcript from your undergrad, for example, or maybe if you apply, in this case, that was from your undergrad, you only need to submit it to the LSAC, and they're going to process it, and they're going to send it to each school separately, which I think is great. But the service fee they charge, that's not great. Or it can be individualized, which means that you have to check schools' websites to learn more about the process. And you can usually figure out if they have an individualized process or standardized process just by looking at, first couple of websites. It's usually some kind of industry that's, has this kind of provider, like law schools have this provider, and that's the only way you can apply to law schools is through this organization. I think for medical schools, it's the same thing. I don't think for MBAs, and I'm talking about master's programs. I don't know if we also cover undergraduate programs here, but this is usually the case for master's programs. For undergrads, I think there is another way to apply, like a standardized way to apply. I think it's called College Board, but again, correct me if I'm wrong. So what you usually do, and I think it was very helpful for me, is you once you have a list of schools that you want to apply to, and it's usually a much larger list that you would end up applying, you Google the name of the school and you write international students. If they have a dedicated page for international students where they provide additional information on things like visas, for example, that usually means that they've accepted international students in the past. And I don't know if that's a big issue in other programs, but for law schools, it definitely was. There are schools that never accepted international students, usually schools located in away from international hubs. So, for example, if you apply to a school in Washington, D.C., you would probably a lot of universities have accepted international students. If you apply to a place like Colorado, maybe that's not going to be the case. So that's what I've done, and I think it was helpful to kind of see the picture of how schools that I want to apply to interact with international students. Since there are so many universities, and you have a list of, 20 universities, and you still want to narrow it down because you don't want to apply and, spend too much time on applying. You can check requirements for different schools. And I've done this by looking at websites of top universities. They usually have very informative websites. They usually have a lot of information on their websites. And what I've done, I opened the Harvard University website, for example, and they had this instruction, like a step-by-step instruction of what you need to submit to get in. And it turned out that this is something that other schools require as well. And their website proved very informative in this regard, and I basically relied on the guidelines that Harvard provided, even though that's not the school that I was accepted to or that I went to eventually. And again, as I said, I started with fee waivers. This is what I've done first. I submitted my applications to schools saying that your application process is expensive. It's going to be very difficult for me to afford applying to all these schools. Could you please provide me with a waiver? And many schools, most of the schools accepted this. And then Stanford Law School, it was basically my lucky shot. I didn't want to apply and I didn't want to study at Stanford. But I still applied just because it was one of the top 3 universities in the US. And I thought, I mean, why not? Also, Stanford waived my fee. So that was another incentive. Speaking of application process, how I prepared for a standardized test in a law school, the test is called LSAT, Law School Admissions Test. And it's a bit different from other standardized tests because it involves a lot of analytical reasoning and logic. I know for other programs there are other tests like the GRE or GMAT, and they have similar portions in them, but they are not the same. So what I've done for the LSAT, I basically took prep tests, which are tests available either online or you could also purchase them. I also bought like a used book with standardized tests from previous years, and I took them. And first I've done them untimed, then I've done them timed. But this was my approach. There are also online courses for a number of standardized tests, just because there are so many people applying to US schools. That you can definitely check them out. And then books. I had a prep book that basically provided me with a strategy on how to approach the test. And I've mentioned this before, but when you research universities, you can probably find a lot of information on what the median score of all the applicants is and how many people they've accepted, like different kinds of statistics that will allow you to assess your chances of getting to a particular school. For standardized tests, I basically took it a couple of times. When I took it the first time, it was in person, so I took it in the American Consul's office in Kyiv, actually, because they administered the LSAT at that time. When the COVID hit, the LSAT was changed to like a virtual online version, which basically means that you can take it on your computer at home. They've also changed the structure of the test to kind of adjust for that. And I found it easier just because you take it at home and you also take it on your computer, which, you don't need to, there was a writing portion, you can just type it in instead of writing it on a paper. And test dates are important. Tests are usually administered a couple of times over the course of the year. The LSAT was administered, I think, 4 times. So that means that for example, if you miss a particular date that's in September, the next one is in December, which means that you are probably going to take it very close to the time when you're actually applying. Or if the application process in the US university that you apply to is on a rolling basis, which means that if they open the application in September and they finish accepting applications in February, that means that they start reviewing applications in September, which means that the closer you get to the deadline, the smaller number of spots in class remains, which means that there is an advantage of applying early. So definitely check test dates of your particular test. Financial aid considerations. And also the considerations for standardized tests, you have to pay for those too. Maybe people take different paths. I had to pay for the test, which was painful. And number of takes can matter. For law schools, they usually look suspiciously at applicants who took the test, who retook the test a couple of times. So definitely keep that in mind. It's usually best if you just go ahead and take it once, and you take it, and you score well. Components of my application, I'm going to go through them really quick. Personal statement, letters of recommendation, also diplomas and proof of prior education, interviews for some programs, and diversity statement. In terms of personal statement, what worked for me, I basically had to write, to spend about 2.5 months to write my personal statement. I started with a rough draft that I wrote in, in a couple of days. Then I submitted it I sent it to a lot of people to, provide feedback. And then I addressed this feedback, which took some time, but it really polished my personal statement, which I think is something that you should consider as well. And also read exemplary personal statements if they're available. They're usually available on some websites that provide consultations for or counseling services for international students or for U.S. applicants. You can find best Harvard essays or something. Perhaps the Press Education USA also has that. Letters of recommendation, I had to submit 2 or 3 depending on the school. They usually value letters of recommendation from your supervisor at work or from your academic supervisor, like a person that, spent some time with you working on some kind of project. I know for US university, that's, pretty easy because you can, do a lot of extracurriculars involving your professors. In Ukraine, this would be someone who supervised your master thesis or any kind of work, or just someone who, who with whom you had a connection during your studies. And it's very important to submit letters of recommendation, not of some, famous, well-recognized people, but of, people that actually know you well. And a lot of people are busy, and they say, write a letter of recommendation and I'm gonna sign it and submit it. Don't do that. Try to find someone who would actually be interested in writing a letter of recommendation for you, because it's going to be much better. First of all, it's going to be more objective, and I also think that if you write a letter of recommendation for yourself, the admissions, they're so good at reviewing applications, and they review them for years. They will, just by the style of it or by any other criteria, they're going to figure out that a person was not the one who wrote the letter of recommendation. For submitting transcripts, as I said, like in my case, the LSAT, this organization that administers the law school admissions process, they required me to send copies of diplomas and transcripts by mail, which I wasn't allowed to do by myself. They said that the school has to provide, either send it on its own, or give you a sealed envelope that you have to send to them. But this is something that you definitely should consider when you planning your admissions process, because the timeline is going to would probably matter a lot. If you send a letter to the US, it can take a while for it to get here. So this is something to keep in mind, at least for me. That was and convincing your school or your dean or a supervisor to, like, I don't know, provide you with a copy of your diploma that's signed, that's in a sealed envelope. That's going to be it's going to take time. At least it took some time for me. Interviews, I didn't have any interviews, but I know they're quite common for some programs, like the MBA program. And they can be live when you're actually talking to a person, or they can be pre-recorded, which means that the questions are pre-recorded. They're basically fed to you, and you have a minute or two to answer these questions. Your answers are recorded, and then a person reviews them later. And diversity statement. This is like an additional component that law schools accept. I don't know if other schools accept it. It's called differently in different programs. But diversity statement is basically a statement that shows how you would contribute to diversity in class. And you can talk about your background. You can mention. Some people call diversity statements adversity statements, because a lot of people write about some kind of an adverse or bad situation that happened in their life and how they were able to overcome it. If you're coming from a low income background or anything like that, you can address that in a diversity statement. And when I say important on the slide, I mean it. Definitely submit it. I also firmly believe that if you submit it and you provide information about your recent experience in Ukraine, that's going to be important for just showing how the situation affected you, and it's probably gonna just provide a fuller background for you. So definitely consider this. I don't know if I still have time. I'm probably over my time. Victoria?
Don't you worry, everything is all right. I would just like us to maybe speak to Tetiana for a bit, but in any case, thank you for such a wonderful presentation. I think we got a really in-depth look into what it's like studying at a master's program at the School of Law, and also thank you for sharing your experience. And I think one thing we can all learn from Kirill is that perseverance is really the key to success, and is something that can help you really succeed on your way to US studies and, yes, make your dream a reality. But Tetiana, once again, thank you for joining us, and I would love to hear a bit about your experience, how you came across your program, and how did your application process go?
So I started my application process in 2020. So basically, this was the time when I decided that I wanted to apply for the US university. And speaking about the program, it was quite difficult to choose the one I wanted to apply for, because at that time I was really interested in education. But my undergrad program in Ukraine was Japanese philology. So I was thinking whether I wanted to continue learning Japanese linguistics or switch to education in general. But then I still decided that I was interested in Japanese linguistics more. So speaking about my background, I graduated from Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, Institute of Philology, Japanese philology, and I also have 3 years of teaching experience. It was really important during my education application process, as Kirill said. You cannot be admitted to the graduate school if you don't have a research or work experience. So that's something that you have to consider when you apply for your program. And so when I came up with the programs I was interested in, so I was still looking for the programs in Japanese and in education in general. So I started to choose the schools, the universities I wanted to apply for. And in my case, I think the biggest obstacle for me was funding from the schools, because there are a lot of schools who accept graduate students, international graduate students, but they don't give them any funding. So in my case, I knew that I had to look for do a great research process in order to find something that would be good for me. So yes, and that is when I started to look for the applications. Usually at first you make so this was the great thing that my advisor from the Education USA told to me, to make a like an Excel or Google table with all the universities you wanted to apply for, and then try to find whether they can give you any kind of funding. So that is the thing I did, and in my primary list there were like 25 universities, from the top ones to the, let's say, backup universities. So where I was sure that I would get some funding and I would be definitely accepted to. And so then I started to write to the admissions offices of these universities, asking whether they can they have some kind of funding, because usually some of the universities mentioned all they have on their websites, but not all of the universities. So be ready that you will have to write a lot of emails. So it took quite a lot of time. So I started to work like thoroughly on the my application process in summer 2021 and in autumn as well. And it took me like, I guess, almost like a part-time job, like 20 hours a week, to communicate with the universities, to write them the emails, to get their responses, or like send them another reminder if I didn't get the response. And yeah, so and here, when you communicate with a lot of universities, the main thing is to keep the track of every university, whether what they reply for you, what they tell to you about the funding, about their admission process. And so then you will come up with your list of the universities you will be applying for. And so in my case, I came up with 4 universities I was applying for. So my like top one in my list was the University of Washington, where I'm studying right now, but I had 3 more universities to apply for. So speaking about the application phase, right, they are pretty a challenging part, because it comes up is that when you are ready with your application form, you have to pay this application fee in order to be accepted for the university, to be considered in this application process. So it is usually from, let's say, from $80 to $120 for regular programs. I'm not talking about MBA or law or medicine, because I didn't know about these programs. So for the rest of them, it depends on the university and on its how prestigious the university is. So some of the universities do give the tuition application fee waiver, but not all of them. So some universities just let's say they don't care whether you can pay them or not. You just have to do that. And some of the universities can give you a waiver just when you come to their some kind of like lecture or some workshop on application process. So it really differs from the universities to the universities. And again, sometimes you can find this information on the website. Sometimes you have to write an email. So don't be afraid of writing so many emails of reminding about yourself. It's totally fine for the during your admission application process. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the application process. So here my application, the list of the documents I had to submit was a bit different from the ones that Kirilla had. So of course, first of all, it is personal statement. And yes, this is not the thing you can write in one day. So that is the thing you have to work on for months or maybe even more. You have to get as many feedback as possible from your friends, your colleagues, other people that you know, maybe some people who already had experience of applying to the universities in other countries. So yes, be sure to be memorable from this personal statement, because this is usually the first thing that you submit. After that, of course, it is letter of recommendation, and I also had to submit 3 of them for most of the programs. And here you can submit the letters. It depends on the university. Sometimes they require just the letters of recommendations from your university professors, or sometimes they can also accept the letters from your employers, or just some letters of recommendations from the place where you were volunteering or doing some other kind of work. Then diplomas and transcripts. And here, when I had a big problem later, because usually when you apply for the program, so the deadline is in December, and they accept your unofficial transcript. So this can be just like a PDF version of your diploma if you're applying after your bachelor's degree. But then, for example, as I had this year in summer, I had to submit my official transcript, and that is when I had a big problem with, because not all Ukrainian universities are happy of giving you the sealed envelope and your sealed diploma. And moreover, I wasn't in Kiev at that moment, and I just didn't get this official transcript. So, but in any case, this is not the end of the world. You can write to your university, explain your situation, like to your US university, as I did, for example, and they waived my official transcript. So in any case, so don't give up when you say that something is going wrong. You can just explain everything, and so the admission offices are usually quite understanding in this in this case. So speaking about interviews, yes, I've heard that there are some universities with that conduct these interviews, but I haven't had any. So for me, it was just the online application. Standardized test. So I had to take TOEFL, and I also took GRE exam. But if to talk about GRE, I didn't have to submit it to any university, because most of them, this is quite interesting, but they have them waived because of COVID. Like because of COVID, not all the students have a chance to pass them now. So that is why they just waived them for at least for last year. I think for the next year as well. And so for me, the another thing that I had to submit was the piece of academic writing. So it had to be an article or an abstract from your thesis. So anything that would show that you can do the research properly. It wasn't required for all of the schools, but at least for the University of Washington, where I'm studying right now, it was required, and they do read it. So they do give it to some of the professors from your department, and they read it to give some feedback. And I was really surprised when at the first department meeting, one professor came to me and talked about my thesis. So it wasn't thesis, it was just an article, but still I was really pleased with this. And so if to talk about the preparation for the standardized tests, so for TOEFL, as I had been teaching English for 3 years, so the time it wasn't that big problem for me, but still I definitely recommend to watch some YouTube videos. There are quite a lot of them on the test structure and on the preparation process as well. And you can also use some textbooks. And so the main thing is to get used to the format of the test. And for the GRE, I think it works in the same way. So there are quite a lot of websites that will help you to get ready for GRE and to pass it successfully. And finally, if to talk about the funding, the thing I started with, so in my university, I work as a TA. TA means teaching assistant. So it means that you, and this is a great thing for, I guess, most of the students who study linguistics or something in this field, but not only. Because so TA is a teaching assistant. It means that you sometimes you just help the professor to teach the course, or sometimes you teach your own course for first year students. So as for me, I teach first year Japanese for the students, and that is how I got my tuition waiver, and I got the scholarship to cover everything that I want, like to cover living, food, and so on. So if to talk about the TA application process, it is usually a separate process. So some of the universities do consider you for these TA positions when you just submit your application form, but some of the universities require a different separate application. So as in my case, it was a separate application, and I had to pass another test for it. It was OPI, which means oral proficiency interview. And the thing how I was getting ready for it, I was just talking in Japanese with my group mates. I was talking a lot before taking this test, and I didn't get a position from the first time. So luckily they had another application in summer, and that is when I applied and I got this position from the second time. But still, there are some other fundings like grants or fellowships that are offered, sometimes from the departments, sometimes from the universities. But you should definitely ask about them before you submit your application form. So I also got a TA position in another university I was accepted to, but they didn't require a separate application for that. So it really depends on the university. Yes, so that's basically how I'm studying here right now. And so if you have any questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Tetiana, for sharing your experience and for highlighting the importance of reaching out to universities and really communicating with them in order to discuss any obstacles you may come across, or just get up-to-date information on your application and the best chance really of getting accepted to that university. It was wonderful to hear your insights and about your personal experience. And I would just like to add that Education USA provides help and support to Ukrainian students who aspire to study in the USA. So from the very first step of looking for university and searching for scholarships or any grant opportunities, all the way up to helping you polish your personal statement, and of course getting your application package ready. And finally, we even provide a little pre-departure orientation to help students really get a sense of what it's like to be a student in the US. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us directly, sign up for a free consultation, and of course get the latest information about US universities and the opportunities that will help you make your dream a reality and get a place at the university of your dreams. And actually, I've got a question to both of you, and that is, what tips would you give any prospective students who wish to study in the USA? What are some of the things you maybe wish you knew before applying to US universities?
Tanya, want to go ahead?
Okay, I'll start then. So the first and the most important thing is not to be afraid of this scary process. It is not that scary as it seems to be. And so as I have already said, don't be afraid of communicating with your universities. If you cannot find some information on their website, even if it is there, you can still write to the admissions office and ask where you can find this and this. They are usually really helpful, and you will get all the information you need. Just don't be afraid. And the last thing I would suggest is do not procrastinate. Do not put everything aside till the last month or till the last 2 weeks. Because so just trust me, submitting an application on the last evening before the deadline is not the most pleasant thing, and it is really stressful and nervous. So it is usually better to do everything in advance.
Thank you so much.
could we please go back to the presentation, because I have like a separate slide. Sorry, I'm like this guy, you know, that brings presentations everywhere. The financial aid considerations is probably something that I haven't considered thoroughly, and it would be great if I knew about this more. It turned out that a lot of universities, they have two systems if they provide funding to students: need-based and merit-based. Merit-based is like depending on how good your application is, basically how exceptional your grades were in your undergrad, and how well you've done on the standardized test. Or need-based, which is like based on your need, how much you need they are going to give you, or a percentage of it. And it turned out that, you know, from all the universities that I applied to, only 3 or 4 of them actually provided scholarships to students without, like, you know, separate applications. And it turned out that, you know, Stanford had this need-based opportunity. So I basically got lucky getting, you know, funding from the university. Otherwise, like if I went to a different university, I would probably have to consider even taking a student loan, which is a cumbersome and long process, and usually kind of expensive because it's a loan. You have to pay it back at some point. Another thing that I found really useful is using Reddit. I have, you know, I provided some examples, but you can probably find them for your program if your program is like a master's program, or if there's a particular university you want to get to into. There's a subreddit for everywhere, for everything, and there are people who communicate about the admissions process. You can ask questions there. It's usually really helpful, although you should probably take it some advice with a grain of salt, depending on, you know, personal situations of people are different. I think what we spoke, and I think Tetiana mentioned this, you know, just find a lot of people to read your application. I would say also allies and enemies. That's really helpful. And find someone to help you out if you have an advisor in education USA. That's going to be really helpful not to be alone in this process. 2 small things are the cost of living is also part of something that you need to consider. You know, tuition is one thing, but the cost of living is sometimes can be sometimes can be very expensive to live in the US. You can cover it if you work as a TA, probably. If you don't, it's going to be another problem, because people usually think that if they have their tuition waived, or if they have, you know, 100% funding that covers their tuition, they are done. But, you know, there is another thing that you also have to pay for: living and food and all these expenses, and transportation.
Yeah, so
And
can I add a bit? Sorry for this.
Sure.
Yeah, so, and even if you get the scholarship, so be aware of the cost of living that is required for your city or your state, because sometimes you think that, wow, I got like $1,000 a month scholarship, is so great amount of money, but it is great amount of money for Ukraine. But here, for example, in Seattle, where there are a lot of big companies, this is actually the cost of like a room for a month. So if you get this like $1,000 scholarship, you will not be able to buy anything like to eat. So that is definitely the thing you have to consider, even when you got your funding and some tuition fees and all these things.
Absolutely. Yeah, and it's the same case for Stanford, that's located in Silicon Valley. Again, a lot of tech companies, I think Seattle has Amazon, right? Probably is the biggest one.
Seattle has Amazon, Microsoft, and
Microsoft.
all, yeah.
Oh, yeah, right, Microsoft. And then one small bit that I wanted to mention, and I think it's related a bit to a diversity statement. I think it's very important to flag this right now. I know it's it's something that you would probably be uncomfortable with using, like, in your application. On the one hand, on the other hand, they really want people from different backgrounds, and programs like law programs, for example, are very homogeneous. You usually have people, US citizens who went to some political science program in their undergrad or international relations program, and they've done some work for Congress, for example, or anything like that, like a government internship, and then they came to law school. So law schools are very concerned about having like a very diverse class, and I'm pretty sure that if you come there as a Ukrainian, it's going to make a difference, and it's also going to make the class more diverse, and it's going to make the conversation in class more interesting. And I'm pretty sure that this is something that you should flag in your application, especially now.
Thank you so much to both of you for sharing your experiences and for giving such wonderful advice to our students back here in Ukraine. I think our students can learn a lot from you and can really get inspired to believe in their dreams and persevere in preparing the documents and continuing to apply to US universities, because their dreams can really become a reality. And of course, Education USA is here to help any of you who are maybe struggling or don't quite know what you would like to study or where to start. So please do not hesitate to reach out to us with any of your questions. We'll always be happy to help you. And I wish the best of luck to you in your studies. Thank you so much for joining us here today. It was wonderful to hear from you, to learn from you, and to have you sharing your experiences. I wish you all listening at home the very best of days. I hope you stay safe. And of course, do not forget to tune in to our next session next week. We'll be happy to see you. So thank you so much, and goodbye to you.